Welcome to today's episode on entities policy commitment towards NGRBCs. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time and joining us today. I am Simoni Rathod from Lodha and Company ESG Practice. Lodha and Company is one of the oldest audit and assurance firm with 6 offices all over the country. This is the second episode of the webinar series on ESG reporting by Indian corporates. Our first episode was on overview of disclosures under BRSR, where we all understood the objective of the disclosures and the various relevant data that the entities are required to report. In our upcoming episodes, we will discuss on policies, procedures, the governance structure that will be required under the BRSR reporting. The purpose of this webinar is purely for educational purposes. Any kind of compliance-related decisions shall be referred to professional advisors. In case of any questions during the webinar, attendees can post their questions in the chat box, and we will address the same after the end of the session. The recording of each episode shall be soon available on our YouTube channel. Attendees are also requested to stay on mute during the session. As we all are aware that with effect from financial year 2022-2023 onwards, SEBI has mandated filing of BRSR for top 1,000 listed entities based on their market capitalization, replacing the existing business responsibility report. The disclosures from the listed entities as per the BRSR relates to their performance against the 9 principles of NGRBCs. Now, to understand NGRBCs, let's dive in deeper into the evolution of NGRBCs. In the year 2009, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs issued Corporate Social Responsibility Voluntary Guidelines. These guidelines were the first step towards mainstreaming the concept of responsible business. The fundamental principle that was laid down was that every entity should have a CSR policy, which should be framed in consultation with top executives and approved by the board. The policy should form as an integral part of the overall business policy and should act as a roadmap for CSR activities. Now, based on the feedback of the Indian corporate sector on adoption of these guidelines, MCA issued the National Voluntary Guidelines on Social, Environmental, and Economic Responsibilities of Business in the year 2011. They were articulated in the form of 9 principles and core elements to implement the principles. These guidelines were laid down basically these guidelines were actually laid down for the enlist the basic requirements for businesses to function responsibly. In the year 2015, 193 countries, including India, committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And apart from this, there were a lot of international developments that was taking place in the responsible business field. So, in order to align the national voluntary guidelines issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and to capture the national and international developments, the process of revision of national voluntary guidelines took place in the year of 2015. After the revision and updation, the national guidelines on responsible business conduct came into the picture. These guidelines were designed to assist the businesses to perform above and beyond the regulatory requirements. Now, I will pass on the virtual floor to Mr. Manishankar Prasad, who will give us an overview on the 9 principles, the framing of the policies to implement the principles, and how the Sustainable Development Goals are linked with the 9 principles of NGRBCs. Mr. Manishankar Prasad comes with 14 years of experience in environment and social consulting across 10 countries in Asia and Africa. Currently, he is the Vice President of ESG Practice, Lodha and Company.
Many thanks, Simoni, for the kind introduction, and morning, afternoon, and evening to all the participants of the second episode. We are grateful for your time, and we hope to have a lively conversation after the presentation. The presentation today follows in a series, in fact, on BRSR, among whom the first episode we spoke about the kind of disclosures. This particular episode, we are going back into the background more into the conceptual framework, the understanding, the epistemic anchors, which undergird the national guidelines for responsible business conduct. So, what is important over here, in order for us to understand, is there's some keywords over here. There's responsible, there is business, and there's conduct, right? As Simone mentioned, as a part of our opening statement, or alap as we call it in our culture, that it's been an evolution, and the corporate social responsibility guidelines started in 2009. Something happened in 2008 internationally. We had the financial crisis. We had a global financial crisis, which led to the meltdown of the financial system globally, which added to a ripple effect across the world, which led to the social movements uh, like all over the world, which spoke up against businesses and against capital markets for being unfair, for being lopsided, for asking for bailouts when bankers were making money. So we have to see this in a larger framework of where these responsible business conduct frameworks and guidelines come from, right? So when we have a look at where does it come from, of course we can paraphrase Zuccotti Park, we can paraphrase the top 1% of the global population which sits on the pyramid. We can also talk about many an environmental accident, right? Something happened in 2010. We had Deepwater Horizon in 2010. It was a massive accident and oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So the petroleum company at that point of time was indicted for poor safety records in the light of cost cutting, in the light of savings, and it came almost on the back of the global financial crisis. So we are talking about global zeitgeist in which there were persistent calls for accountability, uh, for whom global businesses and regulators all over the world were hyper aware. And India also responded to the zeitgeist by calling for these CSR guidelines. We had the CSR law in the updated Company Act in 2013, and also NGRBC in 2018. So it is a part of a global evolution. We have had industrial accidents in India too. We had the Bhopal tragedy in '84. We were also on the anvil for on the tailwinds of other global movements, right? Because we are interconnected, and these businesses are global businesses at the end of the day. So as far as NGRBC is concerned, principle number one is ethics, transparency, and accountability. Basically, it talks about corporate governance at the very top, right? So it is talking about accountability mechanisms at the board level. It is talking about how many board meetings are held, what kind of board meetings are held. Do you have diversity on your board? Are minutes taken of the meeting? In what ways can investors and shareholders and stakeholders can speak to the executive leadership of the organization in an ethical and transparent manner? And what we have to remember is NGRBC has both essential indicators, but it also has leadership indicators. So essential indicators are something which have been mapped to BRSR, and NGRBC is a conceptual framework behind BRSR. That's why we are talking about NGRBC in the first case. And when we talk about BRSR, we are talking about business responsibility and sustainability reporting, right? So again, the business responsibility or the responsible business aspect has been transferred from NGRBC and mapped onto BRSR. And of course, the reporting aspect is there because there is an aspect of trust, transparency, and disclosure, and ultimately all kinds of ESG reporting, even the Make in India version of ESG reporting, which we're talking about right now in terms of BRSR, is also about transparency and trust. It is about holding uh, businesses accountable for their actions so that stakeholders and shareholders find confidence in their operations and accountability. And, and in those terms, Principle 1 talks about transparency and accountability, which hits at the very core of BRSR. Principle number 2 is, of course, product lifecycle sustainability. We talk about LCA, we talk about lifecycle assessment over here. We talk about how many of the materials have been sustainably sourced, how much of the products are being recycled in terms of material, how much energy efficiency is being used over here. Are we using some indigenous material? Are we using some indigenous knowledge in the product lifecycle? Those elements have to be mapped under this principle. Very, very important for certain industries. Materiality is a very important concept over here. So all the principles will be applied onto businesses, but the degrees of application shall vary according to context, and the power of the context has to be acknowledged over here. So, so in case if you are automobile manufacturer, if you manufacture chemicals, product life cycle is fundamentally important. So how do you actually deal with the materials in a sustainable manner? How do you deal with your waste? How do you deal with EPR, for example, extended producer responsibility? So principle number 3 is employee well-being. Employee well-being is fundamental and strikes at the core of every organization. So when we talk about employee well-being, the indicators over here are you employing specially able people? Are you employing women? Are you making sure that you don't hire any anybody who is not supposed to be hired under the Indian labor law, under the Industrial Relations Code of 2020? Are you making sure that they're taken care of in terms of trainings, in terms of access to resources while they are on your workplace, for example? So employee well-being is fundamental, and it is right at the very core of business. It is at the right core of S of ESG, right? At the end of the day. Principle 4 is stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement sounds very, very vague, but stakeholder engagement is fundamental in terms of stakeholder capitalism, right? It's no longer about shareholders only. Who are your stakeholders? Your stakeholders can be your communities, it can be industry associations, it can be your employees, it can be your value chain, it can be your suppliers, your vendors. So you need to do a stakeholder engagement plan. You need to map out influence versus ability to do the work as far as the communities are concerned, and how do you manage your ecosystems. Some companies operate in very, very turbulent ecosystems. For example, technology, where it is a shifting regulatory landscape all the time, where rules are being changed, where social and cultural norms are evolving at literally the speed of bits and bytes and velocity, right? So how do you actually engage with your communities? If you're a mining company, how do you engage with communities who are within your project influence area? Simple. In connection to principle 4 is principle 5, human rights. Human rights is a contentious term, but human rights is extremely important when we talk about a just transition, for example. We talk about how are you dealing with your supply chains? How are you talking about employees within your value chains? For example, if you are sourcing some material from value chains in fragile and conflict-hit countries, how are you dealing with them? Are you doing a stakeholder analysis or a human rights due diligence over there? Because human rights is contentious, but it also means that you are in a way taking care of well-being of people who are not directly within your organizational ambit, but you're taking care of people in your communities and in your value chains. Principle six, environment. Environment is actually an omnibus kind of concept over here. So it varies everything from biodiversity to water to carbon. So it is a very broad set of indicators in which are you recycling your water? Are you having water stress? Are you using zero liquid discharge? Are you taking care about your biodiversity footprint? Uh, are you doing scope one, scope two, and scope three emissions? Scope three emissions are leadership indicators, of course, but are you measuring your carbon footprint as far as your own sources and taking power from the grid is concerned? So these are an omnibus set of concepts, including waste management, and you will kind of realize during the presentation is that each of these principles and indicators are all intertwined and interconnected in a lot of ways. They are almost like indicators in a web. Like ESG are seemingly disparate and separate and fragmented, but they are connected from a prism of risk, right? Because business continuity risk can't be fragmented. It has to be it has to converge somewhere. And in terms of the convergence, these elements, some might be minor, some might be major, but they all intertwine and overlap and intermingle among each other. So principle number 7 is policy advocacy. Policy advocacy might be membership of industry associations. It might also be contributing to election campaigns. It might mean that how do you actually attempt to influence policy, because some industries are heavily policy dependent. Technology is one, in terms of data privacy, in terms of data sovereignty, where does your data eventually lie? And there is demands for localization of data within sovereign boundaries. So how do you make such things happen? If you're in contentious industries like healthcare or like tobacco, policy is business reality. So how do you manage those kind of risks? And everything has to be seen from the prism of risk. So how do you actually manage with stakeholders? Principle number 8 is somewhat vague, but inclusive growth and equitable development. Well, in a country like India, where we are, when many regions of a country are worse off than others, and many people are better off than others, how do you actually manage to operationalize the ethos of equity through inclusive growth and equitable development? How do you do that? Whether it is to CSR funds or whether it is to sustainable procurement of your supply chains, or are you localizing your procurement, for example? How are you doing it? So, so principle 8 provides the rubric, the fabric, the ideas, how to do that and how to measure that, in fact, because reporting is also about measurement. So how do you actually measure these kind of metrics and parameters, which might seem fuzzy and qualitative, but these have to be measured, because what isn't measured is very difficult to manage. Principle number 9 is consumer value creation, which is kind of interlinked to principle number 2, but it talks about product safety. Is your product safe? Is your product safe enough to be used? Very important in FMCG industries and B2C brands. So how do you measure product safety? How do you make your products better in terms of producing value for money to your consumers? So these are the 9 principles which are extremely powerful in every way in itself, but when they intertwine and when you attach it to a powerful operational mechanism such as BRSR, and actually think of how to attach legs and feet to these concepts, how do you actually do it? And these are extremely important set of ideas, frameworks which need to be operationalized within the ambit of BRSR or reporting. And how do you do it? You do it through policies, you do it through procedures. Next slide, please. Okay, how do you actually adopt and operationalize these very powerful set of frameworks and ideas into into assessing, measuring, implementing? So the guidance of adoption might be if a business needs to function responsibly, each of these nine broad thematic areas or principles need to be implemented in its entirety rather than cherry picking whichever is convenient for you. Of course, businesses are different in different industries, and as I mentioned, context is king in these matters. So every business won't have the same amount of conversation, the same amount of intensity of dialogue, the same amount of conversion, the same amount of convergence, rather. But when we're talking about risk, right? Each of these subcomponents or subvectors might not emerge in a resultant uh, in its entirety, but we need to talk about them because every industry will have a distinct set of indicators, or rather, every sector will have different set of indicators as well. As far as BRSR is concerned, not all 112 indicators will be valid for every sector. So, but the most important part in the adoption process is when the rubber meets the road, is how do these principles uh, translate or get influenced by the highest leadership of the organization, the board, and the corporate governance of the business. These have to start from the very top. So the top has to understand that these businesses are not only matters of compliance, but also matters of competitive advantage in order for it to zoom out of the chaos which normally businesses are in while they are understanding such regulatory frameworks or adoption. And let's be very, very clear. BRSR is very well compatible to international frameworks such as GRI, TCFD, SSB, and CDP. But they are also intertwined with local Indian regulatory framework like the Industrial Relations Code of 2020, like the Disabilities Act of 2016, the Company Act of 2013, and various other legislations which are baked into these NGRBCs and also BRSR. The next one, please. So how do you operationalize, how do you attach legs and feet to these powerful ideals? You do it through the framing of policies, which actually bring the soul of these policies into action. So entities are required to develop and disclose information, policies, and procedures related to NGRBC principles concerning leadership, governance, and stakeholder engagement. So each of these thematic areas needs to be boiled down into policies, right? Every organization has a management system in place, and these management systems are essentially assemblage of policies at various levels, at the board level, and the sustainability department, and these are mapped to every processes. Like for example, finance needs to have a procurement policy, for example, or they need to have an auditing policy in place. Sustainability departments need to have sustainability policies in place, for example. So wherever relevant entities have been asked to provide links to the websites where these policies are available. So disclosure, as I mentioned, BRSR is about transparency and disclosure. You might be having these policies, but if they are not visible, you might not comply. Or if you have them, you better show them. So, and you show them in a manner which is public facing in nature. So it's very important that in case you have these policies, you have these links on your website so that the world can see it. So the rationale is to understand whether the policy has the building blocks in place that will enable and ensure responsible business conduct. So how do you actually measure or show responsible business conduct? One of the tangible ways is to build policy and procedures which are in place, which deal with not only business continuity, but also deal with a sense that structures are in place. You have mechanisms in place which are not individual centric, which are essentially building long-term shareholder or stakeholder value for your ecosystem in place. And these policies have to be board approved. These policies have to cover the principles as well as the core elements in terms of adherence to regulatory principles, adherence to laws, and also make sure that your board has ratified them, because this is a matter of compliance. So some entities might have a single business responsibility policy and implementation procedure, which covers all of these principles and its core elements. While some entities might adopt different policies for each of the 9 principles, the core elements of these principles, such as the code of conduct or the corporate ethic policy or the whistleblower policy, can be adopted with mapping to principle 1, and corporate social responsibility policy can be mapped to principle 8, for example. So these are examples of policies which can be mapped to these NGRBCs, which in turn is mapped to BRSR in order to operationalize the theory of transparency into action. Best practice would be to obtain external assurance on the compliance of these principles and core elements. Actually, in BRSR, there is a point in which it's asked whether you have done assurance for these policies and principles or not. So assurance means trust and transparency, because we are entering a stage of ESG reporting globally in which there will be a deluge of data. In fact, there will be a torrent of transformative information available to all of us. But what to believe and what to buy into is a separate question, right? Because assurance means that greenwashing can be reduced over there, and investors and the communities of practice need information and disclosure which is trustworthy in nature. Next one, please. Okay, so here is a rough snapshot and indicative approach to formulate business responsibility policies. So which of your core elements are important to your business? Low priority would be to ensure that the existing policies comply with only the essential indicators. As I mentioned, all these 9 principles have both essential indicators, which are compulsory in nature, let's put it compulsory, and which are leadership indicators, which are a bit of a high bar, but which are international best practices in general. So the high priority would be determine the ambition, the scale, the intensity of each principle according to what is essential, what is leadership, first of all, and then to develop a business responsibility policy and to think through what indicators would map these principles as well as the core elements in place. So it's very important not only to define the policy, but also determine what indicators will be used to measure them, because indicators are the technology of global governance. And without practical, smart indicators in place, what will be measured is very vital to what will be reported, and reporting is for transparency and disclosure. Next one. Okay, now we talk about the global picture. Now we zoom out, have a drone view in place, and talk about the international story. So the Sustainable Development Goals were called into action in 2015 And it's almost like an omnibus set of 17 indicators and in total 169 sub indicators, if I'm right, which calls for every aspect of poverty eradication, environmental protection, fair governance, access to water, whatever you think about sustainability and sustainable development goals has everything over there. And it's pretty much a global project in which you have cross-sector participation from civil society to academia to private sectors to banks to almost everybody in the planet knows about sustainable development goals. And sustainable development goals has an antecedent as well, has a precedent in terms of millennium development goals, which were formulated in the year 2000, which were of course not met by 2015. So they had to extend the goalpost to 2030, recrescent MDGs as SDGs, and then make sure that each of these large goals have actionable indicators over there. So, so countries have committed to prioritizing progress for those who are the most vulnerable among us, who are the most furthest behind among us. And SDGs are practically designed to measure how to end poverty, hunger, healthcare like AIDS, and discrimination against women. So the gender aspect is salient and loud over there, which is brilliant. And also Niti Aayog in India has an SDG indicator index of all the states and union territories in India, among whom, not surprisingly, Kerala and Himachal Pradesh, both very small, progressive, literate states, have done extremely well on the SDGs in general. So these 9 principles of NGRBC and BRSR, as I mentioned, BRSR is very compliant to international protocols like GRIS, SASB, and CDP and TCFD. For example, this NGRBC 9 principles are mapped onto the 17 SDGs, as I mentioned earlier. So I will take something like climate action, which is very quantifiable, which is very measurable, which is very easy to track progress as well, right? So everybody loves carbon within the environmental section of the ESG because it's very measurable. So you have principle 2, principle 6, principle 7, and principle 8, which are perfectly mapped onto SDG 13. Can I head back to the 9 where we mentioned 9 NGRBC? Yeah. Okay, that's great. So we are talking about principle 2 and principle 2, product lifecycle sustainability, 8 and 9, which is inclusive growth, consumer value creation, and of course 6, right? Principle 6, which are mapped onto climate action. So all these elements, which are somehow vaguely or directly related to climate and emissions, is mapped onto SDG 13 climate action. So this is pretty neat in terms of action, so that if you work towards your BRSR goals, you work towards SASB, you work towards GRI, but also you work towards your sustainable development goals, which is neat and cool, which is almost like a one-stop shop, a single window clearance for everything sustainable and everything disclosure and everything issue, which is brilliant. We can head back to that slide. So we have a lot of these things, right? From no poverty, which talks about inclusive growth and development, to almost water, which is SDG 6, which is very important, to hunger, to food security. So almost covers everything, and NGRBC is almost like a mini SDG compression pact for us, which is again mapped onto BRSR, which is very conceptually neat. So this is a very clear interlinkage between between NGRBC, SDGs, and the low and the overall global compact, which we are talking about sustainability. Next one. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention this moment. And at this point of time, there will be a small pop-up quiz, which you are invited to populate, and then we can open it up for a conversation. And looking forward to your thoughts. So I think so. We are coming to the end of the time available for the survey, and those people who have not populated the survey, I would invite you once again to populate the survey. And it's a short quiz of of 3 questions. I would also invite the panelists to pop in your questions in the Q&A chat panel, or to raise your hand up, your virtual hand up on Zoom, so that we can have a dialogue over here for the last 15 minutes of today's session. I can already see some on the chat panel. Should I start, Simone? Is the quiz over?
Yes, Moni, you can begin.
Okay. So there are 3 questions by Tara Chand, and I'll read out the question first, and then I will try to have a attempt at answering them. Is sustainability practices can be adopted by Indian people or stakeholders in India? Like how many persons are available to use everything by sharing or by purchasing? They might not have car or bike, so it's only copy paste. Okay, I got the drift of the question. The drift of the question is that not everybody has got the creature comforts, and is sustainability only copy paste. Well, the element of greenwashing is not only limited to India. greenwashing happens all over the world. As far as sustainability is concerned, sustainability depends upon the intent of the leadership, right? And if it is a matter of compliance, they need to be sustainable, or they need to disclose sustainability measures as a matter of fact. Okay, I'll pick up the second probe from Talachand again. How we think about sustainability, like India, work on GDP, maximum production of products. If we use sustainability, sharing things means lesser profits. So any organization adopting um, adopting sustainability practice in an ethical way. Okay, okay. So we are talking about just consumption over here. We are talking about how to consume sustainably. We are talking about notions of degrowth over here, as I can read through the question. As far as we are concerned, we are a big enough market. Uh, and along with climate equity, we also need to think about the aspirations of people, right? We are a young country with aspirations, and aspirations need to be negotiated with climate commitments. And the people who have extracted and who are in the developed countries right now, the global north as they call it, are also the climate north. They have done most of the pollution, due to which we have anthropogenic emissions and we have global warming. But it doesn't mean that countries in the global south or developing countries such as India have no right to grow, have no right to live a better quality of life. So of course it's a conundrum, but I think so with technology, with better policy making, by better measurement, we can reduce our carbon footprint as well as not compromise on the standard of living. So if you have ISO 14062, I'm not very sure of ISO 14062, but we'll certainly look it up. And if you can drop us a mail at esg@lodaco.com, we can engage in a conversation and a discussion on this. Thank you, Tara.
Moni, there is a question from Mr. Krishnamurthy. While it is not mandatory, how does a consulting company implement sustainability?
Wow, we are also consulting, right? So that's a very poignant question for also us, Mr. Krishnamurthy. Thank you so much for your question. Uh, of course, it's a matter of context, right? Uh, what do we do in consulting firms? We use a lot of technology. We use a lot of IT. We travel a lot. We have a lot of carbon footprint while traveling, right? Both in car as well as by flights when we meet clients, although that has reduced since the pandemic, thanks to Zoom webinars and seminars and calls as we are doing. How do we act sustainably? Sustainability is not about carbon only, right? Sustainability is also about employee well-being. Sustainability is also about taking care of your people. And consulting is a people-centric business. So I think so if you take care of your employee well-being and if you ensure gender diversity within your teams, uh, you're doing your part in sustainability. Sustainability shouldn't be only seen through the prism of environment. I hope I've answered your question, Mr. Krishnamurthy. Thank you. If there are any more questions in the chat, anybody can even raise their hands and just pop in a question, ask me over here. We are more than happy to answer that.
In case of any questions or clarifications regarding BRSR, attendees can also write to us at esg@lodaco.com.
Rest of the panelists, if you have any further clarifications, I will be more than happy to answer. My team is also here. We are more than happy to engage as well. So if we don't have any further question or clarifications, I will invite the participants to register for a subsequent webinars. We still have 3 more of them coming from the series, and we can continue having the conversations on procedures and implementation and reporting in the subsequent sessions.
We have one question from Ms. Tara Chand. Which framework we require to adopt, like thousands framework are available?
Uh, which framework regarding what, ma'am? Which is often the question. Um, are you talking about GRI? Are you talking about carbon? Are you talking about biodiversity? Which is the context? Which is the materiality issue over here? And if you can state your materiality issue, we will certainly be in a better position to answer which framework would be more beneficial.
There is a question from Mr. Sanjog Wadhwani. You can share what you guys at Lodha and Company do in consulting or ESG consulting. What services do you offer in ESG?
Okay, we are a ESG consulting firm, so we of course do reporting, we do decarbonization, we also do supply chain risk. We are more than happy to have a conversation with you in case you can drop in a message to us and we can take it forward. I can see one more question from Tara Chand. It is ESG NGO available worldwide. I did not quite grasp the question. If if Tara Chan can ask it herself, it's much better. Yes, the NGO world and ESG, we have many frameworks, but those frameworks also depend upon what we are trying to attempt, right? We in the NGO world, it's mainly monitoring evaluation frameworks, right? Where we try to measure impact of donor dollars towards the community. In ESG, we try to measure risk, not impact over here. So we try to measure risk to investments, to projects, in terms of climate risk, in terms of community risk, in terms of governance risk. So uh, so the objective of measurement is very different in ESG vis-a-vis the NGO world. We still have 4 minutes to go. So if anybody has any last minute pointers, please ask. Please raise your hand, lob in a question. We hold these sessions every Friday at 4 p.m. the same time. The registration link, you have registered, so the registration link will be sent over to you, to your email ID, and you can register. So thank you so much, all of you, for your patience, brilliant insights, questions, which really stretch us, provoke us to think beyond, think through uh, the difficulties of ESG and implementation and reporting and transparency. So thank you so much, all of you. We look forward to welcoming you to our subsequent sessions, including next Friday. So please do join us, and we look forward to having an engaging discussion with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for giving us your insights on NGRBCs and the Sustainable Development Goals. With this, we come to the end of the session of the webinar. Attendees, in case if attendees are having any questions or require any kind of clarification under BRSR, attendees can write an email to us on esg@glodaco.com. Thank you, everyone.